to work with the people that I worked with, especially Stan and Sarita, who've done so much for the city of Jamestown in so many ways. And then Jamestown is particularly blessed with the artisans that we have from the old furniture industry, and with the Farrells and the people that do so much. And everyone contributed on time to get this room done. This whole building is a jewel for the community, and to have the Robert H. Jackson Center, so now there's a repository for everything that he had and stood for. And I think it's great for Jamestown, and I just appreciate having a hand in doing this room. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll just give you one quick Barclay story. You can see the beautiful tones that are in here in terms of color. And last Thursday night, before he left for Florida, the next day, Barclay went up to Buffalo to a Oriental rug shop and spent an hour pawing through their rugs and came up with this beautiful Oriental you see here, which pulls it all together. Really, if you look at the colors in the room, it's sort of the final capstone in terms of the color situation. So we want to thank Barclay again. Well, now we get down to the main event, Stanley and Sarita Weeks. I talked to Stanley before Christmas about getting involved in paying for this room, and I said, Stanley, we don't have a real programmatic purpose for this room except for speakers who come and for television and radio interviews and things like that. But I said, we'd like to make a room and leave a room here in this building that will let people know what an elegant 1860s drawing room, formal parlor looked like, and would you like to get involved? And he finally signed up, and then he went off to Florida, and we spent his money. And you see it here today. And I asked Stanley, by the way, who was mayor of this town in 1952 and 53, I believe, among all the other things he's done, and a member probably here at the consistory for 60 years or something, and also visited Robert Jackson in 1935 down in Washington when Jackson was Assistant General Counsel to the Department of the Internal Revenue. And so he's got Jackson connections. And I've asked Stanley to say a few words, and then I'd like to introduce Sarita after you're done with your remarks, Stanley.
Thank you very much, Raleigh. This building, the whole complex here, has been part of my life for some years, and I was delighted when Bill Cass called us in South Africa to say that it looks as though there's a contract for the sale of it to the people that were interested in the Jackson Center, which was not yet developed too far, but it was very exciting to hear from Bill, and we thank you again, Bill, for that telephone call to South Africa. But the whole building here has had a very proud history, and I'm much impressed by that. Alonzo Kent, 144 years ago, built the place, and I think it's one of the oldest and most remarkable buildings in the whole city of Jamestown. I remember when I was young, there were many homes of quite prominent, and this one survived the demolition process, which usually goes in a city as they grow older. And then I was associated, as Roland mentioned, with Freemasonry. The Freemasons purchased the property almost 80 years ago, and they were very good stewards, and they were dedicated to a worthy influence of ethics and morality. So they did not besmirch the building at all. They extended the auditorium and the dining room and a very accommodating kitchen, which is still here and now part of the Jackson Center. But the whole complex, and I want to thank very much the artisans and persons who took part in the reconstruction of this room to its beautiful original condition. The Alonzo Kent, you can see in the gold leaf moldings there, the letter K, which was Kent. Alonzo Kent was also a member of the Masonic Lodge in Jamestown years ago. And it was Greg Peterson who enlisted, as he's already mentioned, Carl Tappa and Betty Linnae and the Gebbe Foundation. It's amazing what Greg has been able to do to put together the Jackson Institute. He has done incomparable research, and his energy and drive to succeed has paid off in many ways. Just last night I listened on the television, the Karamatsu program, which Greg put on, and it was a real document and attributed to the Jackson Center through Greg Peterson. And I commend and thank the many people who took part in renovating this room, and they're renovating, which we'll celebrate next week, Betty Linnae's contribution on the outside. But I think the whole complex here is a very tangible tribute to the memory of one of the nation's greatest jurists and our own friend, Bob Jackson. And thank you all for coming this afternoon to celebrate the dedication of this room. Now we can turn it over to Sarita. She may have...
Speaking of amazing, so is your jacket, and you mentioned that that's the family
Tartan, yes.
Explain it. Explain the family tartan. I don't know what that means.
A tartan, of course, that's a cloth that the Scots have in the Highlands. And each clan has its own weave and detail. It's just a terrific thing. They have to have them registered in some sort of an office, but this particular tartan is prescribed for the Ross clan. And of course my mother was a Ross. My grandfather on my mother's side was born in Glasgow before they came to Canada. And they came to Canada, Hamilton, Ontario, and that's where my mother was born, in Hamilton. Then they moved to Rochester, and then eventually to Jamestown.
So your mother's brother was Emmett Ross?
Yes.
Okay.
That was my mother's brother, and when my mother and father passed away, my uncle Emmett Ross and Anna, his wife, took my sister and brother and myself as sort of foster children. And they lived at 1111 Prendergast Avenue, right here.
This would be your mother. Was she born in Scotland?
No, she was born in Hamilton, Ontario.
So it'd be your
My grandfather was in Glasgow. Actually, Govan, G-O-V-A-N, which is, at that time, was a suburb of Glasgow. He was a lawyer, yes.
Where did you go to law school?
Albany.
Albany?
I think it was 1881. Incidentally, he was a charter member of the law fraternity Phi Delta Phi. He was a charter member there in Albany Law. The chapter of the legal fraternity no longer is there. And fortunately, when I went to Cornell Law School, I was able to join Phi Delta Phi as well, which I thought was very nice because that was where my father had joined.
Were you destined to be a lawyer?
No, I was destined to be a doctor. But I went to Colgate University, and at Colgate, unfortunately, my advisor didn't do anything about advising what I should take or what I should do. That was in the early time when advisors for students was in its embryo stage, I guess. So they didn't know what they were doing anyway. So at the end of my first year, it was found that, gosh, what I had taken was not pre-medical, but just a general smear of courses. So I, at that point, decided, well, I guess I'm going to follow my father's footsteps and become a lawyer. And my father, James L. Weeks, was the senior partner in the firm of Weeks and Ross. And Emmett Ross, my uncle, was the junior partner. Way. And that's why I became a lawyer, by accident. I wanted to be a doctor. I don't know why.
So then you went to Cornell.
At Cornell Law School.
Your undergraduate work was where?
You know, it's a complicated history. Sometimes I'm embarrassed, and sometimes I feel a lot of glee. I spent 2.5 years at Colgate, and then I thought I should be in Washington, D.C., because that's where the action was, and that would be good for pre-law. So at the end of 2.5 years, I moved to George Washington University in the District of Columbia, and that was a very wise move, I think, and I look back on it. George Washington, and in those days it was sort of a pedestrian thing. They had streetcars, no buses, and so I walked a great deal. And my classes were in the morning, and in the afternoon I would go to the Capitol buildings for the Supreme Court sessions and both houses of Congress, and some of the commissions were meeting in the afternoon, so it worked out wonderfully. My classes in the morning and going to the government in the afternoon. Incidentally, that's when I went to see Bob Jackson, of course, from Jamestown, and he had been, this was the New Deal period when Roosevelt was holding sway, and Bob Jackson was Commissioner of Internal Revenue. So I and my friend who had come to Washington with me, Alexander Carsilius, Bud Carsilius from Jamestown, both of us went to visit Jackson in his big, luxurious room. It was a huge room, as I recall. And, of course, Jackson was very affable, as he usually was. And it was a very enjoyable interlude. But anyway.
And he would have known you through the relationship with Emmett Ross?
What was that?
Did he would have known who you were through the relationship?
Oh, yes.
Emmett?
Of course, I had known Bob here in Jamestown because our offices, my uncle's, which I spent a lot of time in, was in the Hotel Jamestown, and Bob Jackson and his firm, Jackson, Herrick, Turkin, and Leet, was also located in the Hotel Jamestown. So I used to see him quite often while he was in Jamestown, which was a very pleasant thing because I never saw him upset. He's always a sort of a calm personality, and as you know, a terrific attorney.
So here you are in George Washington, and how long were you there for?
Well, 2 years, and then I graduated from George Washington Law School. That was when the National Cathedral, I don't know whether you've been there or not, but the National Cathedral is just a beautiful structure. But our baccalaureate service in graduation was held in the National Cathedral, which was only constructed as far as the transepts, but the rest of the nave and the superstructure had not been constructed at that time. So that sort of dates me way back. But I graduated in 1939 from law school. 1935, I graduated from undergraduate. So I had four alma maters to contend with, and I didn't realize, but now they're all asking for funds.
They don't forget you.
Instead of just 2, I had 4. But it's well worth it. It was a great experience. As I say, Washington was streetcars, no buses, and we walked. As in those days, we used to walk back and forth to school and our classes, and even to the Capitol, and all the sights of Washington. It was a great place.
So you're there, and this is President Roosevelt's era. This is the era of Charles Evans Hughes as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
Yes.
Did you ever go into the Supreme Court to see an argument?
Oh, yes, yes. Yes, those were all available to us because they all met in the afternoon. Now, let's see, it was Charles Evans Hughes. I lived for a while, I was several places, but 1717 I Street. That was the last place that I was rooming at. And right across the street was the Supreme Court Justice. It wasn't Charles Evans Hughes, but anyway, a retired Supreme Court Justice lived right across the street from 1717I, and every day his chauffeur with a beautiful, shiny Packard. Packard was a beautiful car in those days. they'd take him for his afternoon ride, which was interesting.
Well, let's see, I think at the time, Oliver Wendell Holmes would have been either on the court or recently retired.
I think it was Oliver Wendell Holmes.
Yeah, he's pretty old then.
Yes. It was Oliver Wendell Holmes that lived across the street from us. Now, all that, the buildings that were there, the houses and everything were all destroyed and replaced by government buildings. But I liked the winters in Washington. You got very little snow, but just cold and crisp and blue skies against the white marble buildings. Politics, which was an interesting phase of my life, I guess, because Sid Hughes was the assistant district attorney in Jamestown and a very good friend of ours. He wanted me to run for the school board in Jamestown because he was retiring. He said, "Oh, there'll be a place for you." Well, of course, you have to run for the office. You just can't be placed in an office like that. So I ran and was fortunate to be elected to the school board. And then from the school board, just having returned from the Navy and being young and spunky, I suppose, they wanted me to run for some other office. So you just don't go into those things without going up the ladder. So I then ran for the county supervisor. There were, I think, 6 county supervisors from Jamestown, and I was successful in that, so had a term of office on the county supervisors, which was very interesting. That's when the county home was in DeWittville. Oh, that was a tremendous place. I think it was around 440 acres of farmland. It was almost self-sufficient. They grew their own vegetables and their beef, cattle, and all that. It was a wonderful experience. And then some politician got under their skin to transfer the county home to Dunkirk. Well, then the old county home at DeWittville went into disrepair. They had barns and equipment and everything. As I say, almost self-sufficient, which was a wonderful asset for the county, but politics intervened and it was transferred. But anyway, from county supervisor, then Pat Schobeck and Oscar Linné and Russ Rogerson were influential in political circles at that time, and they wanted me to run for mayor. Well, I did, against Sam Stroke, who was the city mayor, and I was defeated by 411 votes, I think. So I cooled my heels for another 2 years and then ran again. And see, it was a nonpartisan system of elections. So the second time I ran, I got the endorsement from both the Republican and Democratic parties, which pretty much assured me of success. Well, success came my way, and we were elected. And And it was a great experience to be mayor of Jamestown, because my father had been mayor in around 1907 or 19 to 1909, I think. And so...
When was your term?
What was that?
What years were you mayor?
1952 and 53. I didn't run again because I figured if I was going to be a lawyer, I'd have to practice law. If I stayed in the mayor's office, why, all vestige of my legal practice would disappear.
And Moonbrook Country Club specifically. You were kind of there at the beginning, and you and your Uncle Emmett, and tell me a little bit about Stan Weeks, Sarita Weeks, Emmett Ross, and Moonbrook.
Oh, golly. Well, of course, Emmett was dyed-in-the-wool golfer at Moonbrook. He joined when it was in its early infancy, I think, around 1923. And, well, he'd take my brother and me, and sometimes my sister Mary, up to play golf, and he showed us the rudiments of the game, which was very helpful. And he was an excellent golfer. He had a good set of Scottish-made golf clubs. I had some of them framed, and they're up in the grill at Moonbrook now, just to show what they were like. Of course, they're wooden shafts and wooden heads, which now are passé, but they did the work, and we got scores. And sometimes you wonder, well, why do we have all these fancy ones? Well, of course, the makers know what there's in it for them. It's expense. But the old clubs were very, very good. But anyway, 1925, my Uncle Emmett Ross thought there should be junior tournaments. Up to that point, it had been just for men. Women were not playing at that point. So he presented a beautiful cup. It's in the trophy case at Moonbrook now, with cross clubs and a ball, and beautifully designed cup for junior golf. And as fortune would have it, I was the first winner of that cup in 1925, and it's been going ever since, and there's the names of all the winners all over the cup, beautifully engraved. Now they've had to have a new standard so that more names can be put on it. And then I was the JHS, Jamestown High School champion. I don't think there's a trophy for that, but anyway, I was the champion of that. And I played fairly well, and was a heavy hitter with the old-fashioned clubs, wooden shafts, and wooden heads for the first three clubs. But then my uncle, Emmett Ross, he was chairman of the Greens Committee when the second 9 holes was constructed. Now, Moonbrook was quite a place. the first 9 holes, which we played for many years before the seconds were devised, extended around a wooded area, a huge acreage of wooded area. And the gullies were rustic and difficult to get in and out of. Now there are these pools of water. They've dammed them up so that the pools are very challenging. And but the old ones, the old days, they used to have golf where you'd carry your clubs or have to have a caddy. You didn't have even pull carts or electric machines like they have now. Of course, real golf is a walking game. And of course, a lot of men can't walk that distance anymore, so they have a cart. More of them should walk and could walk, but a lot of them can't, which is understandable. And Moonbrook had its stages, different layouts at different times. The major holes are still intact. Some of them across the highway now went up to just north of Dr. Sanctuary's home. And then those 2 houses on North Main Street near the city line. That was, one of those was Horace Breyer's house. And that would then go down the hill to where the highway is now, if you can visualize that. But in those days, the country club, which was actually the golf club, it wasn't the country club. It didn't have swimming pool, it didn't have tennis courts, it didn't have any of those other things. So it was the golf course. Now it's the country club. Let's see, what was I going to say? I don't connect here. But
The layout of the club.
yes, well, the layout of the club was considerably different, particularly when the highway was constructed. It cut it in 2. So there have been a number of changes because of that. And Frank Vassallo, whom we met this morning, has been an excellent manager of the club. He takes care of all the interior part of it and has done marvelously to keep it together. And he's been manager of the club longer than any other person before him. Oh, what I was going to mention was that the first clubhouse was an old farmhouse, and you would approach from North Main Street just beyond where the new highway entrance is, and go up, and there was this old farmhouse, and that was the clubhouse. And eventually it's where Howard Holmes and his family, Howard Holmes was one of the professionals. He and his family lived in this old farmhouse. And Wally Holmes now, who owns Maplehurst Country Club, was brought up there and got his first instructions on how to play golf from his father. So hole number 1 started just above there, and that would be now number 3. Number 3 presently was the original number 1. But
when did women become part of the golf scene? I mean, certainly that was a good part of Sarita's life as well. She loved it.
oh yes, well, as soon as we came to Johnstown after marriage, she wanted to get in to play golf because she had been on the varsity team at Wellesley College and also played with the varsity members at Yale, although they didn't have women on the Yale team, but they had her come along on a number of them. So she wanted to get right into the game. She was good. She could bat them right out. And she was head of the Ladies Golf Association there, and that was at one time. And she figured that they weren't regulated enough. So she decided the USGA rules of golf, that's the United States Golfing Association rules, should apply to women as well as the men. So she did see that that was brought about so that the women would be playing under the same rules. Since then, I guess they've abandoned the USGA rules for women, but I'm not quite sure as to what extent. But at one time, she was the Moonbrook Women's Champion, and on several occasions she won the Packard Cup, which was donated by Mrs. Packard from Lakewood, and had a number of other wins to her credit. But she was head and heels for that, and it used to be among the men as well as the women. The women, they'd have teams that would go out to other clubs like Olean and St. Bonaventure and Corey and Erie and Dunkirk. They would go and play the ladies from those other golf clubs, and she delighted in that.
That whole time in that whole world, what were these organizations? How did they function? Who ended up doing what in what organization?
Oh, golly, I don't know. They all had their virtues. I suppose they were all organized on the basis of bettering the community, and there were fraternal fellowships. They got together. The Odd Fellows were a tremendously extensive organization. There were 3 Odd Fellows lodges in Jamestown. There was Mount Tabor was the most prominent, and then there was the Ellicott Lodge of Odd Fellows, and then the Monitor. The Monitor was the Swedish unit of the Odd Fellows, because I think it was an Ericsson that invented the Monitor during the Civil War. So they took the name Monitor. And at the corner of 4th and Main Street, kitty corner from St. Luke's Church, is the Mount Tabor building. It's probably the most attractive building in the city.
I know exactly which one you're talking about. It's where the road descends.
Yes.
And it's on the right as you're coming down the hill.
That's right. Just beyond the WCA,
right.
YWCA. That was the the Mount Tabor Temple, very prominent. They had thousands of members.
Mm-hmm.
But then there was the Knights of Pythias and the Red Men of America. Gosh, oh, so many different organizations. But some are still going. Of course, the Masons, which is the oldest organization in Jamestown, really, organized in 1817. That was just 8 years after Prendergast put his sawmill on the rapids, which is the Chautauquoin River. They've been going ever since, and still quite strong. And of course, Jackson was a member of that,
Right.
as well as Greg here and his father.
Okay. And are you a Mason?
Yes.
Okay. How does one come to be a Mason? Is it through your father or your uncle being a Mason?
No, it doesn't. That isn't a qualification. It's just if they want to be associated with the Masons, they ask a member of the organization for an application to join.
Okay.
And then, of course, it has to go through an investigating committee to see whether they're
Mm-hmm.
proper persons, reputable and moral, and they have to have a strong belief in God. And if it passes, then they go through their degrees.
Okay. And what's the hierarchy? I obviously know that the pinnacle is 33 degree,
Yes, that's...
but I don't know the steps leading up to that.
Well, there's what we call the Blue Lodge is the first 3 degrees. That's Masonry. The first 3 degrees, if you have those, you're a definite full-fledged Mason. Then it can branch off into what they call the York Rite, which is predominantly English Masonry. And then there was the Scottish Rite, which is a rite which really originated in France. They called it the Scottish Rite because a number of Scottish Masons lived in France, and like most of the nobility in France were members, and Voltaire and very prominent figures, and that spread over into United States. And Bob Jackson was a member of the Blue Lodge in Jamestown, and then he became both a York Rite Mason and a Scottish Rite Mason.
And did they had separate buildings and were separate?
Eventually they had separate buildings, yes. This beautiful building on 3rd Street, kitty corner from Lucille Ball Center, was the building for the York Rite and the Knights Templar, which Bob was a Knight Templar. That's Masonic, with the plumes and everything. And then the Scottish Rite purchased the property at where the Jackson Center is now.
Right.
So they were unfortunately separated, but because of the size of the organizations, they had to be separate.
Mm-hmm.
And Bob Jackson went up through the degrees on both sides, the York Rite and the Scottish Rite, and eventually was what they call coronated, a 33rd degree Mason.
In Philadelphia, I think. I think he had to.
Is that where he got his?
I think that's
That's
right.
where I got mine, in Philadelphia.
Okay.
I'm not sure I know, Stan, but what is the process to be coronated a 33rd? Is there a nomination process? Is there a...
Yes, it has to be, like each state has the process whereby the deputy from the Supreme Council would select prominent Masons in his district, which would be the state of New York. And I know there were 7 selected out of the state when I became a 33rd. And how many were selected at the time Jackson was, I don't have that knowledge. And then that's presented to the Supreme Council for consideration, and if they decide that a certain person is qualified, then they make the selection at the Council of, not the Council of Deliberation, but the Supreme Council when it meets.
That is the highest honor.
Yeah,
33rd degree is the highest honor you can get.
in the Northern Masonic jurisdiction, yes. There's a Southern jurisdiction of Scottish Rite too, which has many more states than we have east of the Mississippi and north of the Mason-Dixon line. That's the Northern Masonic jurisdiction. And then the Southern jurisdiction has the whole sweep of the remainder of the country. Of course, each country has its own Supreme Council too. So we're just 2 councils, like France, England, Brazil, Mexico, they all have their Supreme Councils, which is an elaborate organization.
At what age did you begin Masonry?
Oh, I was about 30,
Okay.
something like
So
that.
there's no teenagers, it's adults.
No, from 21. You got to be 21.
Okay. What is a typical meeting at the Scottish Rite Consistory? I mean, in Jackson's day, when he would attend Masonic functions or events, or
Well, we'd have what we call reunions, and that's when we'd put on the allegories for the degrees for the candidates who are in the class. We just finished one here last week, a reunion. We had 2 reunions a year, at which they're quite formalistic and interesting to witness. But in the 3 degrees, which is basic Masonry, which is very good, it's according to some of the ancient constitutions and the ancient rituals. King Frederick the Great added certain degrees in the Scottish Rite. He was very interested in the Scottish Rite Freemasonry in Germany and in France. Then the Swedish Masonry is still a little different. They have a little different degree system. I'm not too familiar with it. Maybe Greg is, but he says no. But I've been able to attend meetings all over the world. in Hong Kong, in China, and Singapore, and the Barbados, and in Scotland. It's been interesting to travel and attend their meetings. If you're a Mason, then you can
Right. You're welcome.
show that you are an up-to-date, you're paid up dues and all that.
Uh-huh.
They permit you to attend their meetings. Ernie and Greg knew him. It was Frank Taylor. He courted Mary Jackson, so was very familiar with the Jackson family, and as a matter of fact, he said he almost got to the point of marrying Mary Jackson. He knew the Jacksons and Bob Jackson, and more than anybody, I think, that I ever knew.
Oh.
Actually, Frank is the one that had this bronze plaque put up at the center,
Oh, right. Right.
explaining, and his picture, and had his
Right.
picture framed. But Frank Taylor was the one who improvised that. And
So, it sounds like he's no longer with us.
no, he died just about a year. Did Frank Taylor die about a year ago?
About 2 years ago, yeah.
About 2 years ago.
Okay.
Ah, it's a shame that he isn't living and could have dwelt on that, because
What about the next generation down? Are there Taylor children or
no,
other people who would have been part of that familiarity with the Jacksons?
I'm not sure. I don't think so. You know, we've all died out.
Um,
Can I interrupt for a
Sure,
second?
of course.
Oh.
Stan, we've got this in the
Yeah,
Mason Archives from the Book of Marks. Could you explain that?
I saw that
Yeah.
in the Book of Marks. And this is York Rite Masonry, and this is the Bob Jackson. And when you go into York Rite Masonry, there's the Mark Master and different parts of that, and you're supposed to, you know, in ancient times, when the stonemasons would hew a stone, fitting it for the building,
right.
they would make it their mark on it.
Right.
You've
Sure.
probably seen them. They're
Right.
different marks on their stones, like Harry Truman. Of course, he was a 33rd degree Mason too. When he had the restoration of the White House, there were a number of stones in the original building of the White House that had the Masonic marks on them. And he saw to it that one stone with the mark on it would be sent to each of the Grand Lodges in the country, which is amazing.
Yeah.
But anyway, when you become a Mark Master Mason, you have to devise a Masonic mark, which you, if you were a stonemason, would engrave on the stones to identify the stone that was
Right.
your masterpiece. But this is what Bob Jackson did. He devised a horse head because he was so interested in horses.
Right.
And here's he had a beautiful signature.
He certainly did.
And description horse head, and that was in 1930.
Right.
That,
On his birthday, actually. February 13th was his birthday. So this is his 38th birthday.
was that right, on his
Yeah.
birthday?
On his birthday.
Mm-hmm. Well then,
I didn't know he had artistic ability. That's a nice little sketch.
yes,
Pretty hard to chisel into a stone.
yes.
Um,
But it's remarkable that you got this, Greg. I remember going through the Book of Marks and I came across Bob's, but
You mentioned it when we interviewed you a couple years ago.
I
Now,
see.
What do these letters stand for? I'm not sure where to begin, but
Well, it's Hiram Tar, widow's son, sent to King Solomon.
he won a big case. The Salisbury Axle Company. There was litigation about the sale of it, and basically the buyers were trying not to make the last payment on the deal. It was a large amount of money. Jackson represented the seller, and they were successful. And at the time, I think it was one of the bigger verdicts, maybe the biggest verdict in this part of the state. And it's right about the time he buys the property and builds the house. What's the name of the street?
Fairmount Avenue?
Fairmount Ave, right. So I'm wondering if that was the sort of financial breakthrough.
Well, I have no knowledge on that.
Okay.
But that Salisbury Axle Company is that was the one that had the automobile, wasn't it?
Yes, they did.
That was Sam Carlson, the mayor of the city, was selling stock in it to so many of the Swedish people, and because he knew it was going to be a good company to invest in. And then when it went broke, he and Ernie Cockcroft, his corporation counsel, were worried about his being reelected. That was what I was telling you at the Historical Society meeting.
Great story, yeah, tell us there.
And so Cockcroft was a cagey sort of a guy, nice guy, very intelligent, but he was a corporation counsel for Sam Carlson. And they wondered, well, how are we going to get out of this? Because all the Swedes that had invested in it were very upset about Sam Carlson. So they devised a plan that the day before election, they put these pamphlets on the doorstep of all the Swedes up on Swede Hill and wherever they were, said, get the Swedes out of City Hall, vote for whoever the other guy was. Boy, that really got the
Rally the troops.
Swedes back into their Sam Carlson's fold. So he won hands down on the next election, but they feared that he was going to be defeated.
That's good.
Well, as I mentioned, it is a long story. Not for me, but of course, Sarita was born in Mexico City on December 1, 1913. And her parents had come from Fredonia. And so every summer, and she bewailed this fact, she was sort of a hardship, but anyway, the parents thought she should visit her grandmother, who was located in Fredonia. So they would come up by train. Of course, there's no airplanes in those days. They came up by plane, or by train, to Fredonia. And my aunt, Anna Ross, with whom I lived in Jamestown, was a sister of Clara Sessions. Well, the Sessions were related to Sarita's grandmother as well. So quite often on weekends we would travel from Jamestown to Fredonia to see the family and the grandmother and all that. Well, on this one occasion, Sarita was visiting her grandmother from Mexico. So we were just little tykes, maybe 8, 9 years old, and that's when I first met Sarita. And I'd been in touch with her off and on for no good reason other than the relationship. And when Sarita then, after she was 10 years old, she went to Neuchâtel, Switzerland, where she lived for 7 years. Well, I had corresponded to Sarita in a funny way, and would send her some funny papers, the Katzenjammer Kids and Bringing Up Father and those old funny paper articles, which she enjoyed receiving. So we kept that relationship until she then went to college at Wellesley, Massachusetts, in Wellesley College, where she was there for 4 years, graduated, and then went on to Yale Drama School. She was there for 4 years. So during that period, while we would correspond, and not thinking anything about marriage, that was furthest from our thought, I guess. And, well, that was how we met it. I had my car, an old DeSoto car, which I'd had on blocks during the war. I had that back and would drive up to Troy, New York, the Russell Sage College where Sarita was teaching. She was in charge of the French house, where incidentally everybody in the French house, everything they said had to be in French. You couldn't intersperse it with English at all. So it was, she was in her glory because, she could be very fluent and could teach it. She'd been to other colleges and taught French and Spanish. But anyway.
And lovely golf down there. And then I was at Cooperstown, where they had the Knox School. And there was where Stanley came to see me. And you have no idea. I lived at La Maison Française. And everyone spoke French, the teachers living there and the students. And Stanley came up the steps in one of those, to the Maison Française, in his navy blue uniform, and so handsome and straight and young. And I looked through the window and up above from the stairs, and so did all my little friend pupils, as it were. And we all just, well, anyway, they kept close track of me, and Stanley came back many times, and as I was teaching there.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the way it started.
When did he propose to you?
Oh, dear.
Or how did he propose to you?
Oh, it was just so logical. You know, I hardly remember how. You know, it's just so logical that we should be married. And
we decided to be married. Well, that was a little difficult to have anything formal. So we decided
I
that,
want to know, was it a joint decision, something that just happened? How did you propose to her?
not on bended knees, but next thing to it, I guess, I just thought, well, why don't we get married? And so she called her mother, who was then living in Dunkirk, and everything was fine. Well, and where we were going to get married, it wouldn't be formal because it was, the circumstances weren't proper for that. So we decided to be married at Hamilton, New York, where Colgate University was, where I'd been in college. And the little Episcopal church, the rector there was a member of my fraternity at Colgate, but somewhat older, Sammy Burns. And so we decided on the Christmas vacation, when most of the students were home, that would be the proper time. So we stayed at the Colgate Inn, which was a very nice place to stay, and we got married there and spent most of our honeymoon at Hamilton. So that was how it happened. It's a long story, isn't it?
Terrific story. It's a terrific story.
Well, we lived happily ever after. We never had any real arguments. We saw that each other was able to play out their own part, and she was very supportive in everything that I did.
You mentioned earlier that Sarita supported you in your activities, and you supported her in her activities. What were her activities?
Oh golly, she was into everything, and she was quite a public speaker. They called on her constantly to give a speech to this organization, that organization, and she was always ready and willing to do it. She was a very delightful, intelligent lady, and could remember her experiences. And gosh, she had a speech on hats, ladies' hats, which was a winner. And certain dresses that she would speak about. She was always into costumes. She liked costumes. When she was a youngster, why, she was constantly wearing different costumes, whether it's Dutch or Spanish, and she did Spanish dancing, and even here she did Spanish dancing for some groups that wanted it. And she was good for putting on all those things, and she didn't charge anything for herself for these speeches, but then she got to the point where she figured, well, something has to be charged, otherwise it'll just be inundating her for giving speeches. So she would require, say, $15 or $20, but it would be by check payable to the James Prendergast Library, particularly the children's division. That was her forte. She was good at it. And, she and everything. She was good at organizing and implementing and seeing things were done right, which was part of her life.
So logical that we should be married. And, well, anyway, we've had a most wonderful life. We have 56 years together.
Great,
You know?
congratulations.
Yes, and I mean, Stanley and I were both very antique. Oh, my. Stanley is 90, and I am 89 tomorrow.
Can you believe this?
But her legacy is terrific. Have you seen the obituary copy?
One of the Post-Journal?
Yeah.
Or the booklet you put together?
Booklet.
I saw that, yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, that sums up a lot of it. I wish I were more vocal, but it's hard to be separated from her because she was always a wonderful helpmate, somebody that you could always rely on for almost any occasion. It's difficult that she has passed on. We had always assumed that I would be the one that would be going first. And I know that she would not have aggrandized so many of the things that I have tried to do since she passed on. But that is as it is now.